Hey guys, it's Dr. May. How are you? I hope things are good with you. I have a really cool topic for you today. I'm going to call this topic Transcending Our Stories. Okay. So what does this mean? Does this mean bedtime stories? Does this mean novels? I don't know. Well, I guess it depends on how you take it. Okay. So here we go. So think about transcending, meaning rising above, right? So you're not trapped in the stories you tell about yourself, that you're going to rise above them and create something new. Okay. So stories we tell. So if you think about it, the past that we've experienced is already done. And when we remember it, it's in part a story we tell about ourselves. Now, obviously, there's some images and feelings and sensations that are associated with our stories, but a lot of times it's a verbal narrative that we either tell ourselves in our head or we tell other people out loud. So when we think about different things we've been through, we have a certain way of telling the story. And sometimes these stories evolve over time, and sometimes the stories get very stuck. And it's important for us to look at, how are we telling the story? Am I believing my story as if it's the only way to tell it? And is it really completely the truth? Or is there another way to see it? Right? So we could actually be a little more flexible about it than we think sometimes. Okay. And what happens is, if we get too rigid about it, we kind of form our identity around the story, and it has a big influence on us. And it could influence like the kind of choices we make now and the situations we get in now. So it could kind of keep us a little bit stuck. All right. So that's why it's important for us to start to examine this. How do we tell ourselves stories about our life? Right. Okay. So this is just a little humor injected into the situation. So sometimes we have what I'll call our greatest hits. Maybe there's certain sob stories that we like to tell, and we always tell them kind of the same way. And it's kind of like, push one to hear my story about being abused, push two to hear my story about failing out of school, push three to hear my story about divorce, right? Whatever it happens to be. And then, you tell that story, that horror story or that sob story, right? And what happens every time you tell it, right? How do people react? How do you feel? Does it solidify a certain experience or feeling, right? And is that working for you, right? So something to reflect upon, okay? All right, so think about it. Here's a reflection question, and I'm going to answer it to a degree, but think for yourself. Like, why do you think we keep telling these stories? What is it doing for us? Because if it didn't do anything, we would have let them go, but it's serving some kind of a purpose. So let's just reflect on that. Like, why do I personally keep telling this story? What am I hoping to get from myself, from other people, from life, from my emotions? Okay. All right, so let's go on. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons. So the pros, okay? So one reason why we keep telling the same thing over and over again is because it gives us a false sense of certainty and predictability, right? If I keep telling the story the same way, it makes something feel less vulnerable and less uncertain, a little bit more fixed in my mind, okay? So kind of like Linus with his blanket, it gives us a sense of security and familiarity. Like, oh yeah, I'm telling this story about this problem I had again, and it feels kind of familiar. So instead of venturing into something new, which might be better but scary, I keep going back to my story. Okay, so think about that. How do we keep that sense of predictability by going back to the same thing? Okay, it also helps us to create a certain sense of meaning. It helps to figure out what our life was all about and why we went through this and why we're feeling the way we're feeling right now. So it in part helps us to make sense of our life. It may not always be the best way to make sense of it or most accurate way, but it fulfills that purpose to a degree, okay? And sometimes it's even helping us to feel more in control or important, right? If I tell a story that's kind of dramatic or sad or, crazy or whatever, it gets a certain reaction, right? And sometimes I feel special because of this pain that I went through. And repeating that story is my way of connecting with people because I haven't figured out a different way to connect with people. Okay, so it's serving a purpose. All right, so just to kind of track, like, where do I fit on this spectrum? How do any of these apply to me? All right. All right, so cons though, okay? So as I started to say before, the problem is if I always tell the story the same way, I'm going to keep getting what I've always been getting, right? You do the same thing over and over, you get the same results over and over. So it keeps me stuck in a limited reality. And I start to make choices that justify my story. So if I tell myself a story about how I'm not that smart, or how I'm damaged goods, or how I'm, no good or not good enough, that informs what happens in my life right now. I start to confirm my story by living out my life that way. And that's limiting for me, because instead of allowing a different possibility of what can happen, I bring it back to that limited reality. Okay. And that's sad, because it could hinder us from being our best self. Okay. And prevent us from exploring new possibilities in our life. Okay. So here's some problematic story themes. Okay. And obviously the details change from person to person and situation to situation, but sometimes it kind of confirms these deeper beliefs that we now hold about ourselves, right? So like nothing ever works out. I pick some events in my life that didn't work out, and now I draw this conclusion that nothing ever works out for me, right? Or I'm not good enough. I was treated this way by this person and this way by that person, and therefore this is what this means about me, right? Or it could be a story about blame or resentment. Like, because of this person, this is now the way I am. It's this person's fault that I messed up, or this person's fault that there's something wrong with me. Okay. And I keep telling that story. Or maybe I've been betrayed by people, I've been mistreated by people. So I'm always telling a story about how I can't trust anybody. I have to rely on myself. I can't meet new people. I can't get into a relationship because this happened to me. Right. So that's a very limiting story. Or maybe I've been rejected by certain people, or I feel different and I feel like I can't fit in anywhere. So instead of opening myself to the possibility of blending in, I already shut it down by saying, well, I'm just too different. I just can't fit in. I'm not like these people. Okay. On the flip side, which is problematic, although sounds positive, telling a story about how important you are, or how special you are, or how much better you are than other people. That's limiting too, because it sets you apart from others. So instead of allowing yourself to blend in with other people, now you're telling yourself a story about how good and different I am, but therefore I'm not like these other people. And it prevents you from having better relationships. Okay. So think about if you have any of these themes in your stories, or maybe some other problematic themes that I didn't cover. I mean, obviously there's much more than this. I'm giving a few examples. Okay. Okay, so moving toward some possibilities and solutions. So how can we break free from our stories, all right? So if our stories are limiting for us, how do we transcend them, as we say in the title, right? So break those chains and become like those birds flying free, all right? So I'm gonna tell you. So first, mindfulness, right? Mindfulness isn't everything. We have to be aware of the fact that we're stuck in a story, or that we're telling ourselves a story again. Oh, there goes that story. Oh, I pressed one and heard my greatest hit about being abandoned again. Okay, so we got to remember that, oh, here I'm telling my story. It's not necessarily the truth. It's just my version of events. And I'm more than that. I'm not just my story. There's much more to it that I'm missing, right? And how do I open my eyes to what I'm missing? Okay. And here's another thing to think about, right? Like, let's say I work in a hospital, right? And let's say on the ward, there's an event. Let's say there's a fight between two people. And there's 24 other patients that now viewed that event. And if you ask each one of them to tell the story about what happened, everyone's going to tell you a different story, right? It's the same physical thing that happened, but everyone's point of view is different. So your point of view can be different, right? You're the same person, but you can view the same event through different eyes and a different set of meanings to draw something new from it. But the first step is to be aware of the fact that you're even telling it, okay? So that's always step number one. Mindfulness is the key to it all. Okay, so here's another twist. Because the stories help us in some ways, it protects us from vulnerability, it gives us some sense of meaning, and all the pros that I talked about before, we could thank our story for trying to help us. Thank you for being there for me to make my life a little more predictable and serving this purpose, and helping me feel a little safer. So I appreciate it, Thanks a lot. Okay, so not in a nasty way, but in a kind of like understanding the purpose of it way. Okay, so it helps us to not just demonize it, but appreciate it for what it did do for us. Okay, so now here's a tricky part. Try to let go of your story, loosen your grip on it, and I'll say unknow yourself, right? So before we were knowing ourselves through the story we were telling. So what if we were to unknow ourselves by releasing that story? Okay, that's a little bit scary, but it's scary, but it opens up a possibility. You have to unknow yourself before you can re-know yourself. Okay, so be willing to sit in that vulnerability, you know, and the uncertainty of the not knowing, but from there, know that new things can come. Okay, and possibly better things. Okay, so how do we create a better thing? We got to go back and re-examine the original events, right? Not through the lens of our story, but in a different way, right? So these kids here have a lens that they're looking through. We got to put down our old lens and look through a new lens, okay? So the new lens is more about finding something meaningful in a more positive way, right? Because everything is here to help us. Everything has shaped us into who we are, and there's good that can come from it, okay? So what kind of other meanings can we find from the event that's more helpful for me now, okay? What are some of the gifts that I've gained from it? You know, maybe although it was painful, I learned something about empathy. I learned something about resilience, about coping, about survival, or something, right? There's something we've gained from it. So what, you know, like knowledge, wisdom, or insights have I gained? You know, all that stuff could be built into your new story, but we first have to figure out what it was. Okay, how could I re-see it and find those things? And what did I learn from it that maybe I could use now to benefit other people, right? Some people have been through very painful experiences and then they take it and share. That's what 12 steps are all about. That's what bereavement groups are all about, right? We use what we've gained from our own pain to influence the lives of others in a positive way. Okay, so all these things can be incorporated into our new version of what had already happened. Okay, so now we're going to try to tell a new empowering story. And you could do this in writing. You could literally write out the old story in your usual way, which shouldn't be too hard to do because you probably practiced it a lot. So then put that aside and try writing it from a totally new point of view, incorporating some of those meaning making aspects. Okay. So empowering story, right, integrates different areas of your life. It helps you figure out how did I become who I am now in an empowering way. You know, what was the important ingredients from them that helped to boost my level of personal development? It's about turning alchemy, right? Which is about turning lead into gold, right? That was an old science from a few hundred years ago. And scientists were trying to figure out how could we like use some chemistry stuff to turn lead into gold? So how am I turning my painful lead story into the gold of, you know, meaning and personal resilience and coping, right? So how do I convert that? Um, and remembering that, you know, think about like a cake recipe. Okay, so you have some stuff like flour and eggs and maybe milk, maybe baking powder, maybe, you know, baking soda, whatever. And some of those things you can look at and be like, why do I need a pinch of salt? Really, maybe I could just leave that out. Or baking soda, you know, I just want the chocolate in there. Who cares about the baking soda? But if you leave out the stuff that seems irrelevant, you're not going to get the same cake. Okay, you got to put the stuff in that even seems like not that important or not that desirable, because that's the recipe that leads to the good result, right? So even the negative things in our life are supposed to be there. Maybe there was a reason why we went through all of it, because all of those pieces were necessary to make us right now. Okay, so inclusivity and wholeness is part of the empowering story. Okay, remembering that all the elements, even the reactions that we had and the stories we used to tell, are part of the whole picture that we need to incorporate and love anyway. All right. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So give it a try. Try to rewrite your story today or work on it, right? See what happens from there and how that changes and opens up more possibilities for you. Okay, so important part of recovery. All right, thanks for listening, guys, and I'll see you soon. All right, bye for now.